So I just prepared a short outline that will go online very soon of at least the 4 things that I would like to present today. The first one is just discuss the jobs challenge. I thought it was useful to remind ourselves what are we talking about, what are the challenges when we think of jobs. And then the next slide, please. Yeah. And then what were some of the pre-pandemic labor market disruptions, because we're very focused on what's happening today, but there were major changes before what happened since February this year. And then some possible medium and long-term effects of the crisis that we expect. And then to use a slogan that now is becoming very popular, the Building Back Better, which what I will talk a little bit about policies that we think would be important to consider. Now, next slide. Let me start with the jobs challenge. We call it challenge because creating jobs, it's one of the most challenging tasks ever. In fact, despite the focus on jobs over the past years, we still have very disappointing outcomes in the market. Here, I listed just 4. We have 600 million jobs needed over the next decade. I mean, we say between now and 2050, and this is just linked to the demographic boom and the shortage of jobs that we currently have. We have 250 million need, which is the youth that is not in training, not in employment, not in school. We still have 2 billion workers in the informal economy, at least with the data that we have, which is 2/3 of the workers. And we know that we still have a very important gender dimension. We know that women, are most often excluded from the labor market, they pay low salaries, and they take care of the unpaid household work, etc. And to this challenge, the COVID now is adding. I'm sure several of you saw this, the ILO forecast in terms of job losses. But I wanted to remind ourselves that based on those estimates, we expect the unemployment to rise between 140 million, which is the optimistic scenario, which means without a second wave. The pessimistic is 340 million jobs, which is the pessimistic scenario, which expect a second wave, which is already happening. So not only was already challenging to deal with job creation, but now it's even more. And let me just, the next slide, I just presented a couple of slides just to give ourselves an idea of the magnitude. This is just for a number for the Middle East and North Africa region, for example. They lost 25 million jobs. And these people were already dealing with the need to create 300 million jobs. So on top of a huge challenge that was already affecting the region, now it's becoming even more challenging. Next slide. This is one slide for Morocco, and there are slides like this for all the countries. This is a survey that was just finalized. About 50% of firms shut down in the country. And this number is not just peculiar to Morocco. Like, we see so many businesses that couldn't make it, and we expect even more to close. So this COVID crisis is impacting the supply, but also the labor demand significantly. And then I'll talk later about some of the expected medium to long-term impact of the crisis. The next slide. Before we discuss some of the disruptions that were already there, I just wanted to bring one important aspect when we think about job creation, which was also highlighted today. To create jobs, we need economic transformation. If growth, it's not enough to create jobs. In fact, sometimes we see growth and in parallel some job disruption or unemployment. Creating jobs requires economic transformation, requires the country move from the low value added sector to the higher value added sector, require people to move from rural to urban, requires firms to move to the modern jobs, to the new skills. So this is multidimensional, and that's why it's so difficult to create jobs, because it's not just one factor that needs to move, it's multiple factors. And this will lead us to the creation, not just to more jobs, to the better jobs. We know that the majority of people, especially in developing countries, are unemployed in the informal sector. So people do have jobs. It's a matter of underemployment. It is a matter of the bad jobs, the jobs where we don't see people growing or be rewarded or being formal. So we want more jobs. We want the better jobs, which are the ones with the higher labor productivity, higher wages, but inclusive jobs. We talk so much about the vulnerable. The vulnerables were excluded even before the COVID crisis. And to create the better jobs, we need economic transformation. I have here, if you haven't done so, I encourage you to read this. It's a very short read. It's called Pathways to Better Jobs, where this concept of economic transformation is very nicely explained, and explains all these multiple dimensions that needs to change. So this is just to frame the issue of the job creation and the need not just for more jobs, for the better jobs. Now, next slide, please. Let's remind ourselves that labor markets were going through significant disruptions before the COVID crisis hit them. And here, I would just like to remind ourselves some of those critical changes. Now, most of the changes were linked to the technological progress. And I would like to highlight three of those changes. One is the reshaping that was undergoing for the demand of skills. Now, technology, robots are replacing workers and tasks that of course, could be automated, right? What we call the routine-based type of jobs, the skill linked to that. So we were seeing the demand for the high-order cognitive skills like math or critical thinking, social-emotional skills going up, and the demand for the manual skills going down. So there was a big change because all the low-skill workers were being replaced by robots, and that was pretty massive in high-income countries already. So this is the first change. The second change is the disruption of the production process. This morning, we talk about the digital platforms. The digital platform changed completely the way we do business. Think that the physical presence is no longer a requisite to run a business in a country. Google can run business anywhere in the world without being physically present. Plus, the digital technology was allowing some, what we call the reshoring, right? Instead of producing in China, companies were producing at home, in high-income countries, because, with 3D printing, you could do it today. So it was already started to change the way we do business and the global value chains all over the world. Third change is the change in employment relationship, which means that with the gig economy, the traditional full-time 9-to-5 jobs, started to stay there, but becoming less common. We see a lot of freelancing. How many Uber drivers we see in the world? How many people working for digital platforms? And with the COVID crisis, we saw the boom of Amazon. So this is important to think about because it's something that will happen even more. And that changes completely the way we think of jobs. So those three changes were undergoing, and we think that the COVID crisis, we just make them even more relevant. Because if you think about those three, they become more and more of a reality if the world stays like it is today with this crisis. And just to remind also ourselves, what were the policy takeaways for those changes? We published a World Development Report back in 2019, in which we call for three policy responses from governments. One is the strengthened social protection. which we also discuss later. We call for a universal social protection in a world where the employment relationship are changing. There are a lot of informal workers. The current social protection system really have a very low coverage. So in order for workers to upskill, to be able to move from one job to the other and to be productive gig workers, we need everybody to be protected. So we call for a universal social protection, regardless of whether and how people work. Number two, ramp up investment in human capital and lifelong learning. This is a fast changing world, and the past few months showed us even more brutally how things can change fast. So be able to rescale very quickly is very important. Therefore, education can't just be limited to high school, to university. It has to accompany us throughout our working life. Number four, adapt market regulations. The presence of digital platform requires us to think how we regulate those platforms. We talk about taxation today, which is linked to point 3, but also point 4. In order to tax digital platforms, which at the moment are avoiding, not evading, avoiding in a purely legal way taxes, we need to be able to track them. And at the moment, where Google produced the value, nobody knows because it's intangible. So this is what was happening before. Next slide, please. And now the COVID. What we expect? We saw a huge response in the short term. We see governments taking action. We see people losing jobs, but this is still short term. We need to start thinking what's happening in the medium to the long term, because some of the pre-COVID challenges can also be addressed. So we expect the COVID to reinforce the labor market trends that I just presented to you. We expect a big recession, and this actually comes from OECD numbers for Europe. In the beginning, we thought it was a V-shaped recession. Now it seems instead a very long recession, which is U or L-shaped. But for sure there'll be very long period of weak labor demand. We also expect households and firms to come out from the crisis with either low savings or even debt. Now, yesterday we discussed, Stefano Scarpetta presented some of the results on inequality, and I connect to the next presentation. I'm sure we talk about it. So we have, different effect of the COVID for different groups, right? We have the youth is highly affected, the women, yesterday we talked about, and the informal workers. But I would like to reemphasize that we expect a huge difference between developed and developing countries, because they have less jobs that are amenable to remote work because of the skills that are demanding for those jobs. Think about the job, the low-skilled jobs, construction workers, but also because the digital connection, this is something that is still not present in too many countries. We expect, because we have a prevalence of low-skilled jobs, which, work in the sectors that have been highly hit by the crisis, informal workers, 2/3 of the labor force in developing countries is informal. And the situation in high-income countries is not too different. It's just a different type of informality. And then because there is low access to social protection and income support in those countries. Next slide, please. But there are other characteristics that are common all over the world that might make the recovery more challenging for countries. The high reliance on imports. How many countries rely on imports? And we saw a huge disconnection of global value chains due to the COVID crisis, and with the businesses closure, they might stay with us. The state dominance of economic activities and the limited competition. Competition is very important for the private sector to start, working again, to be dynamic, and for jobs to be created again. And we see that in very few countries. High levels of debt, it was already a big issue. And now with those short-term intervention for the COVID crisis, it's gonna be even worse. High informality I already discussed, but also the productive use of digital economy. The digital economy can be used for social media or can be used productively, meaning for jobs. And that's it's still in its infancy in too many countries. So what changes we expect? Next slide. I wanted to show 5 of the changes. This is work in progress. I put that, so I really hope I can get some feedback and reaction to those ideas. So we expect changes. We expect a new normal. Yesterday we talked about the fact that we won't go back to business as usual because some of those changes will stay with us. What are the changes that we expect to stick? So one is the organization of work, right? Firms are more and more thinking how they can be resilient. So how they can, in case of a lockdown, work, although workers need to be distant, and there should be also distance between client and customers. So they're rethinking their internal organization. So once they invest into that, most likely they won't go back. 2, the digital technology. It is, it is turbocharged compared to what we saw last year. People are working from home. Firms are investing more and more in digital technology. We see a lot of e-health, like people even doing doctor visit with digital. So that this bigger investment that hopefully will make, because as I say, it's not widespread, will stay. Corporate strategies in the past for companies were still convenient and cheaper to produce certain parts in, for example, Italian companies that were still producing, certain parts in China or in Eastern Europe because it was cheaper. Nowadays, companies say, well, I can keep producing there, or I can start producing in Italy because in case of another disruption of value chains, I can maintain my production, although it's more costly. So once they invest into that, they won't go back to the production in Eastern Europe or China. Consumer preferences, we see people moving, stop using services that, require that are, imply physical proximity, or for goods, for example, that don't require that for minutes. And then the public programs and mandates. Governments are facing huge calls, and they won't be able to just discontinue that, right? We talked yesterday about exit strategies, but think about social protection, think about infrastructure, support to businesses, and support to human capital. That is a big shift in the government's not only programs but mandates. So those are 5 things that we think will stick around. And let me I have a few more minutes. Next slide, please. So what to do and why, again, we want to rethink jobs and social protection, but the way we were already thinking about them before the crisis. So the COVID crisis, it doesn't, of course, it makes the jobs challenge worse. But the way we see it is that it increases the urgency of policy responses that were needed even before. Think about the digital exclusion. As I mentioned, like too many countries and people are still don't have access to digital. Nowadays, that it's unacceptable. The strength of the fiscal resource mobilization, right? Already the fiscal space was very tight. What do we do today, right? We need to focus on that because, governments already intervene and this call remains over the next months. Universal social protection, the pre-existing socioeconomic disparities and vulnerabilities that, require the call for universal social protection before February this year stay, and they will be even worse. So universal social protection is even more important now. And then we need to think how we can support firms and jobs. Like, this is the perfect storm because it affects both demand and supply, which in the past, it's not precedent. So how we support the firms, but at the same time the workers in a context of physical, like limited fiscal capacity and limited access to digital. Let me just conclude by saying that one aspect that it was already evident before, but the COVID has underlined, is the incomplete coverage of social protection systems. right? So those are graphs that we had, before, where we show that. But one good news, which I would like to share with you just before we end, is that we see an unprecedented response in terms of social protection. If for years we advocated for universal social protection, we see so many countries taking on this challenge. And we had more than 150 programs in 120 countries for more extended social protection over just the past 4 months. So there is hope, and definitely that trigger action from government that it didn't trigger before, but how we respond, what programs, and how we make sure this stays in the medium and long term is the big challenge. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
How do you evaluate the proposal for a universal social protection as policy response to the pandemic crisis?
What is in the SDG called the social protection floor. I think this is important, and also in relation to what I mentioned about unemployment. If you are not in a wage situation or a situation that you can put money aside, you are dependent on basic social services, which is furnished by the state, and not by contingency social services for which you pay yourself. And I think we should distinguish very strongly between those two things. And in that respect, I was wondering, she mentioned as one of the possible problems in one of her slides, the state dominance of economic activity and limited competition. Now, we have been discussing before, and that was also shown by the enquete by Brown, that there is more willingness by the public to accept the role of the state. So I like her to elaborate a bit why she sees that state dominance is a negative thing. Of course, you can have bad and good state dominance, but to just throw it away with the bathwater, I think is not relevant and could be maybe even put our discussion on the wrong footing. And then just from a political economy point of view, it was also raised by Masukatu and others in the slides I produced. We really have a kind of acceptance of that something should be happen. And so my question is, what about a much more vigorous campaign for a social protection floor from trade unions, from everybody, so that by using the evidence provided by Frederica in presentation, we really bolster much more the idea in the SDG 1.3 of a social protection floor and campaign more on that. Thank you very much.
What's the EU policy response for a universal social protection?
There is a plea for universal social protection, and this is not only important, let's say, to cover those workers who may be affected by unemployment or other circumstances which are related to low incomes, but also in macroeconomic terms, because we know that countries with better functioning social protection systems have also been better protected by the consequences of the crisis in macroeconomic terms, and the size of the shock has been lower. Nowadays, one of the keywords that are buzzing around is the one of resilience. So the capacity of an economy to respond to sudden shocks. And definitely social protection and skills are among the main driver for having resilient economies and resilient societies. And therefore, this is a principle that is quite important, not only at European level, but also in a more global perspective. Thank you very much.
Low versus high-skilled jobs. Is this the challenge of the future?
So at least from the initial ones, what I understood is the fact that also the demand for some high-skilled workers goes down, right, with the technological progress. which is very true. And of course, it depends, you know, from the country, the sector. But what we have observed for high-skilled workers, if in the country, if first of all the workers have what we call the adaptability, so they're able to upskill, and there is a good upskilling program in the country, then these people could go through a temporary, you know, loss of employment, but they are able to move from one to the other. An example, the banks, you know, what we used to call the loan analyst, like the banks had so many loan analysts in the past. When that function got automated, most of them managed to switch into, you know, the loan, you know, the people who are in charge of the loan algorithm, for example, right? So we have several examples of within the bank of these, you know, medium to high skilled workers that managed to switch. So the problem becomes when there are the low skill workers for which the demand for labor goes away, and these people have no adaptability because they don't have the right human capital with them, and there are not oftentimes the right programs to upskill them because of those limitations. So then these people stay out of the labor markets. Instead, the high-skilled workers are the ones that manage to adapt, and you know, it's a natural process with technological change. So for them, it's a transition. The fact that they need to change their skills and move to different type of functions, while for others it's permanent, and there where the problem comes. I didn't understand the one about the poor that are less covered questions, which I felt it was a good one. What I could say is that we actually see the poor not being covered. And one issue, especially from social protection, is that our delivery systems are not ready to tackle these people, because in some countries, these people do not even exist because they're informal, they're household, you know, that are completely informal. So you know, it's not so much about the way the social protection programs are designed. Oftentimes, it's a matter of the delivery system. It cannot reach to these people, and that's something we're working on with the help of technology. But I'm sure I didn't get this one. I get the one about the new challenges from the professor, and there are many new challenges that add to the challenges already brought up by the technological progress. Let's think just about the tourism sector. There was a sector that, you know, will give jobs to so many low-skilled workers. You know, it was pretty solid in a number of countries. You know, some countries didn't even have to invest so much, like in certain things, in order to get tourists and get a good income. Now, you know, it is a matter of, it's a completely new challenge that we didn't have until a few months ago. How do we support that? How we did reinvent a sector like that? How can you think of upskilling when the problem comes from somewhere else? It's not that technology is changing that, you know, it is just that the demand is going away for different reasons. So there are a lot of new challenges, especially as I mentioned, from the labor demand side, which were not present before the COVID. On the question of social protection, whether it's firms or whether it's government, that's a question that also came from another person online. So that it is something that needs to be analyzed, like depending on the country situation. I mean, clearly, countries go through transition, firms go through transition when they need to adapt. So the question is whether, you know, if you compare, you know, severance pay or unemployment subsidies, right? If firms are struggling, let's say, to adapt to technological change and you know, they need to adjust their workforce temporarily, then in that case, then perhaps, again, based on an analysis of the country, you know, it might be wise to have unemployment subsidies, so the government step in, so it's not a cost, you know, for the firms. They can, you know, adjust their workforce and move right to you know, a modern, a different sector, industry, and there they'll create more jobs, right, at some point. And then at that point, of course, you know, they can pick up again the cost of social protection. My director always say, you know, the best social protection we can offer to people is a formal, good job, right? That's the end goal. But in transition, we always call for this, or at least we think the flex security system a good model that a lot of Northern European countries implement, where the government step in when firms can go through transition, or people temporarily lose their jobs. Then there is a government support. But there's such a dynamic private sector in those countries that companies have been able to go through that economic transition, which is critical to create the good jobs. So whether the two, depends on which stage the country is. I think there was a question that was asked afterwards. And the same thing when we think about the sustainability, which was another question of the public expenditure. I mean, we can do analysis of the tax system and of course of the poverty, because a lot of countries, are not efficient the way they deal with the fiscal space. There are a lot of energy subsidies in countries and no expenditure, for example, for social protection. A lot of countries, they don't have a tax base because a lot of workers are informal. There is no capacity. There is, again, no efficiency. Let's remind ourselves that the digital platforms at the moment are not taxed. And if you look at the figure, the equivalent, like the income that will be brought to countries, if we manage to figure out how to tax digital platform, it's humongous. So that is a very unexploited pot of money that would help with this. But again, it's all temporary, permanent. If governments need to step in, like in a situation like now, and it's temporary until we overcome it, we recover, we go through the economic transformation, one thing. If that help, that support is permanent, that becomes unsustainable.
Thank you, Ms. Saliola, Ms. van der Oven, and Mr. Lucidi. What we get from this session is that pursuing a job-rich recovery means that the recovery plan must fund investment that change our development model while introducing new rules and protection for workers with two aims. 1. A generalized improvement and a modernization of wages and working conditions. And 2. A universal protection system in which nobody is excluded because of his or her position in the labor market or society. These include a universal minimum income scheme. Better jobs come also from investment in high productivity sectors, distributing wealth across society better, and investing more in people, especially training for adults and digital skills. In a situation of high debt for state and households, taxation must be shifted away from labor to digital platforms and companies.